Frozen desert. It's the only way to warm up, said the Apache woman. The cowboy couldn't move. The desert was not usually a place anyone would think of as dangerous in winter. Most people imagine deserts as hot, dry places where sand stretched endlessly under a burning sun. But this desert was different. Winter had arrived early, and with it came biting winds and unexpected snow. The dunes, usually golden and soft, were now capped with white, and the air felt sharp, cutting through thick coats and scarves. Each breath felt icy, and the wind seemed to pierce right to the bones of anyone unprepared. A lone cowboy rode slowly along the edge of the dunes. His horse's hooves sank slightly into the snow-covered sand, making it hard to maintain a steady pace. The cowboy was a tall man with broad shoulders, and his hat was pulled low over his eyes to shield them from the wind. His coat was thick, but it was no match for the cold that seemed to seep into every layer of clothing. His gloves were soaked from the snow, and his boots were heavy with frost. He had been traveling for days, searching for a way through the desert to reach the next town. Supplies were low, and the trail was confusing. He had followed the tracks of a small herd of cattle, hoping to find them or at least follow their path to safety. But the snow had covered everything, and he soon realized that he was lost. The landscape had changed so much in the last few hours that familiar landmarks were now hidden beneath a blanket of white. Panic rose in his chest, but he tried to steady his breathing. He had survived harsh winters before, but this was unlike anything he had ever faced. The sun hung low on the horizon, pale and weak, barely giving any warmth. Shadows stretched long across the dunes, and every hill and hollow seemed like a potential trap. The cowboy tried to keep moving, telling himself that stopping would be dangerous. But the cold was relentless. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, and every step felt heavier than the last. Frostbite was starting to set in, making his fingers stiff and painful. His horse snorted, stamping its hooves, as if it too sensed the danger. Then in the distance he saw movement. At first he thought it was a trick of the wind, maybe snow drifting across the dunes. But as he looked closer, he could see a figure moving steadily along the ridge. It was a woman, and she walked with confidence and purpose, despite the wind and cold. Her clothing was different from his own. She wore a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and her moccasins left careful tracks in the snow. She moved with an ease that suggested she knew the desert well, someone who had lived with it and learned its secrets. The cowboy stopped, unsure what to do. He wanted help, but he also felt wary. People in the desert could be unpredictable, and he had learned to rely on himself. His pride whispered that he should continue on his own, that he could make it without help. But his body was growing weaker with each step, and he realized that pride might cost him his life. He rubbed his hands together, trying to bring back some warmth, but it was no use. The wind stole the heat as quickly as he could make it. The woman had noticed him now, and she paused. Her eyes were sharp and observant, and she studied him without speaking. She seemed to be deciding whether he was friend or foe. The cowboy took a cautious step forward, and the snow crunched under his boots. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace, hoping she would understand that he meant no harm. The woman nodded slightly but said nothing. Her silence was calm, not threatening, but it made the cowboy nervous. He wanted to speak, to ask for help, but the words caught in his throat. The cold made it hard to think clearly, and his mouth felt dry and stiff. He tried again, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm lost. Could you help me?" The words were barely audible over the wind, but the woman heard him. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved closer, her steps deliberate and careful. The cowboy noticed how steady she was, how her body seemed to resist the wind instead of fighting it. He admired her skill, even in the brief moment he saw her. He felt a mix of relief and nervousness. Relief because someone knew the desert and might save him, and nervousness because he did not know what her intentions were. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, almost soft, but carried a sense of authority. "You should not be out here alone," she said. "The desert is dangerous in winter. It can kill even the strongest man if he is not careful." The cowboy swallowed hard. She was right, and he knew it. He had underestimated the desert, and now he was paying the price. He took another step forward, trying to look confident, though he felt anything but. I didn't think it would be this cold," he admitted. "I've been traveling. I thought I could make it." His voice trailed off as the cold sapped the strength from his body. His fingers were nearly numb, and his legs felt like they were made of stone. He realized he might not make it another hour without help. The woman nodded, as if she understood exactly what he was feeling. She motioned for him to come closer, and he did, though slowly. Every step was painful, but the thought of her guidance kept him moving. He noticed the way she scanned the environment, pointing out subtle signs of danger that he would have missed. A hidden patch of ice, a snowdrift that could trap his horse, footprints that showed the presence of wild animals nearby. As they walked together, he tried to ask questions about her. "You live out here," he managed. She looked at him and nodded. "I know this land. I know how to survive here. The desert has rules, and if you do not follow them, it will punish you." Her tone was firm but not cruel. He realized she was speaking from experience, not fear. They reached a small hollow in the dunes, a spot where the wind was slightly less harsh. She began showing him how to make a temporary shelter using branches and snow as insulation. The cowboy watched carefully, noting how she used every piece of material wisely. He realized that she had been preparing for winter survival for years, learning from her ancestors and the land itself. He felt a pang of regret for his own arrogance, for thinking he could handle the desert on his own without understanding it. Night was approaching and the cold was becoming more intense. The cowboy shivered uncontrollably and his teeth chattered. The woman noticed and moved closer. "You need warmth," she said simply. "There is no shame in needing help. It is the only way to survive." Her words struck him. He had always prided himself on independence, on being able to face any challenge alone. But now, standing in the frozen desert, he understood that survival sometimes required humility. He nodded slowly, though he still felt awkward and uneasy. Pride was a hard thing to let go of, especially for someone who had lived a life of self-reliance. But the woman's calm presence, her knowledge, and the urgency of the situation made him realize he had no choice. Survival was more important than pride, more important than fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the snow-covered dunes in shades of pink and orange, the cowboy and the Apache woman prepared for the night. He felt a mixture of fear and gratitude. He knew the desert would not forgive mistakes, but for the first time that day, he felt a spark of hope. The desert was harsh, but with guidance, it could also teach him lessons he had never learned before. The wind howled louder as darkness fell, carrying with it the promise of a freezing night. The cowboy felt the weight of the day's journey in his bones, but he also felt a growing respect for the woman who had appeared when he needed her most. She was not just a guide. She was a lifeline in a place where one wrong step could mean death. And as he followed her instructions, building a small shelter and preparing for the night, he realized that survival was not just about strength or skill. It was about knowing when to accept help, even from someone you barely know. By the time the first stars appeared in the clear desert sky, the cowboy was exhausted, but alive. He had learned that the desert demanded respect, patience, and humility. And most importantly, he had learned that help could come from unexpected places, and that accepting it could mean the difference between life and death. The night in the desert was colder than the cowboy had ever imagined. The wind seemed to cut deeper after the sun disappeared, and the small shelter they had built offered only limited protection. He huddled close to the small pile of branches and blankets that the Apache woman had arranged with careful precision. The warmth was faint, but it was enough to remind him that he was still alive. He had never felt so vulnerable. Every sound, from the faint howl of a distant animal to the whisper of snow sliding off the dunes, made him jump. He realized that the desert in winter was not silent. It spoke in small, sharp noises that demanded attention. The woman moved around the shelter calmly. She was gathering additional small branches, checking the snow for weak patches, and making sure the area was as safe as it could be. Her movements were smooth and confident, the result of years of living in this unforgiving land. She worked without a word, but the cowboy watched her intently. There was a rhythm to her actions, a flow that he had never seen in someone who was so at ease with danger. He could not help but admire her skill, even as he shivered under the thin layers of his coat. Finally she spoke, her voice steady and soft. "You must pay attention to the desert," she said. "It is not like the plains or the mountains. Every dune, every drift, every shadow can hide danger. And it is always changing." The cowboy nodded, though he felt guilty for his earlier arrogance. He had assumed that his experience as a cowboy, his knowledge of the land, would be enough. But this desert had shown him that he had much to learn. He tried to respond, but his teeth were chattering too violently. He could only manage. I didn't know it would be like this. I thought I could manage." His voice trailed off as he realized how weak and unprepared he truly was. The woman looked at him with understanding, not judgment. "Strength alone does not save you," she said. "Knowledge, patience, and respect do, and sometimes help." Her eyes held a quiet intensity, a reminder that survival was as much about humility as it was about skill. The cowboy shivered again and pulled his coat tighter. He realized that he had been relying too much on his own abilities, too much on pride. He had never asked for help easily, but now he understood that survival required more than pride. It required trust and willingness to accept guidance. And yet, even as he accepted this truth, he could not completely shake the discomfort of depending on someone he barely knew. The woman noticed his hesitation. "You are afraid," she said simply. "That is natural. You do not know me, and yet you must rely on me. That is difficult, but fear does not have to control you. Learn from it. Use it to stay alive." The cowboy nodded, taking in her words. He felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. Fear because he was in a place where mistakes could be fatal. Relief because someone who understood the desert was guiding him through it. They spent the night quietly, the woman instructing him in small ways that made a difference. She showed him how to insulate himself using snow and branches, how to keep his core warm, and how to move without losing heat. Every tip was simple but effective, and the cowboy realized that he had underestimated the harshness of the desert and the brilliance of the woman guiding him. He tried to follow her instructions carefully, though the cold made it difficult to concentrate. His body was weak, but his mind was beginning to awaken to a new understanding of survival. As the night deepened, the desert seemed almost alive. The wind whispered through the dunes, and shadows danced in the moonlight. The cowboy listened closely, trying to catch every sound, just as the woman had instructed. He began to notice patterns, the way the snow shifted with the wind, the faint crunch of ice underfoot, the distant cry of an animal searching for food. He realized that the desert communicated in subtle ways, and if he paid attention, he could understand it. At one point, he accidentally stepped on a weak patch of ice covering a small hollow, and his foot slipped. The woman caught him by the arm instantly, steadying him before he could fall. "Watch your step," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The desert is always testing you. One wrong move and it can cost you." The cowboy's heart raced as he realized how close he had come to injury. He felt a mix of gratitude and humility. He understood now that he could not rely solely on instinct. He needed guidance, observation, and careful attention. Hours passed slowly, and the cold continued to bite. The cowboy tried to sleep, but it was impossible. He lay in the shelter, muscles stiff, teeth chattering, while the woman remained alert, listening to the night. Every now and then, she whispered instructions or advice, helping him adjust his position or cover himself more effectively. The cowboy felt a strange sense of comfort in her presence, even though he was exhausted. She was a constant in the chaos of the frozen desert, and her calmness gave him strength. Eventually, dawn approached. The first light of the sun painted the snow-covered dunes in soft pinks and oranges, a quiet beauty that contrasted sharply with the dangers of the night. The cowboy felt a flicker of hope. They had survived the coldest hours, and he realized that he owed his life, in part, to the woman guiding him. He had never experienced anything like this before, being completely dependent on someone else's knowledge and skill, but he also felt a growing respect for her. They moved carefully as the day began. The desert in daylight was still harsh, but at least visibility made travel less dangerous. The woman continued to teach him small survival techniques. She showed him how to read subtle tracks in the snow, how to find pockets of warmth under rocks, and how to conserve energy without losing progress. Every lesson was practical, rooted in experience, and the cowboy absorbed them eagerly. He realized that his pride had blinded him to this kind of wisdom, and he felt a deep sense of appreciation for her patience. At one point, they came across a small, frozen stream. The cowboy tried to take a step forward, but the ice was too thin. The woman stopped him, pointing out the cracks and weak spots. "You must always observe carefully," she said. "The desert is not only snow and sand, it is hidden dangers. Step without thought, and you risk more than you know." He nodded, understanding that survival required constant attention, awareness, and caution. He felt his respect for the land deepen with every step. Throughout the day, the cowboy tried to speak more, to ask questions, but he was careful to listen first. The woman answered patiently, explaining her methods, her experiences, and the principles behind her actions. He realized that her knowledge was not just practical, it was also a philosophy. Survival was about observation, humility, and respect. It was about understanding limits, accepting help, and learning from every moment. By the end of the day, the cowboy's body was exhausted, but his mind was alive with new understanding. He had learned more in one night and one day than in years of traveling alone. He had seen the desert not just as a place of danger, but as a teacher, strict, unyielding, but fair. And most importantly, he had learned to trust someone else, to follow guidance without pride standing in the way. As night approached again, the woman prepared another small shelter. This time, the cowboy helped more actively, following her instructions carefully. He felt a growing sense of confidence, not in his own strength, but in his ability to adapt and survive with guidance. He realized that survival was not about fighting the land, but working with it, understanding it, and respecting it. That night, as they settled into the shelter, the cowboy felt a quiet gratitude. He had been lost, cold, and alone, but he was still alive. He had met someone who understood the desert, who had taught him the value of knowledge, patience, and trust. And he knew that the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever, shaping the way he saw the land, people, and even himself. The wind howled outside, but inside the shelter there was a small warmth. A warmth born not only from blankets and fire, but from guidance, understanding, and human connection. The cowboy closed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion of the day, but also the hope that he could face what was coming next. The desert was still harsh, still dangerous, but he was no longer completely alone. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that survival was possible. The desert grew even colder as night approached, and the cowboy felt the deep bite of frost in his bones. Each breath came out in white clouds, and the chills seemed to settle deep in his chest, making it hard to think clearly. The small shelter they had built offered some protection, but the wind found its way through every crack, and the cold seeped in relentlessly. He huddled closer to the small fire the Apache woman had managed to light, feeling the flickering warmth brush against his frozen skin. He had survived one night and one day in this frozen desert, but he realized that survival was far from guaranteed. The cold was relentless, and his body was beginning to fail him. His hands and feet were numb, and every movement was an effort. Frostbite was no longer just a possibility, it was a real threat. His pride and stubbornness, which had carried him through many challenges before, seemed useless now. The harsh reality of the desert was undeniable. Without help, he might not make it through another night. The Apache woman watched him carefully. She moved silently, gathering firewood and checking the shelter for weaknesses. Her eyes were sharp and focused, and she seemed almost immune to the cold. She had learned long ago how to survive in these conditions, how to use the land to her advantage, and how to keep her body warm when the desert threatened to steal it away. She knew exactly what the cowboy needed, even before he realized it himself. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made the cowboy pay attention. "You are losing heat too quickly," she said. "Your body cannot survive like this for long. You must find warmth, and you must do it now." The cowboy's heart pounded. He knew she was right, but a part of him resisted. Accepting help in this way went against everything he had believed about pride and independence. She moved closer, and he noticed the steady confidence in her movements. "There is a way to survive the night," she continued. "It is not ordinary, but it works. You must stay close, very close. It is the only way to keep the core of your body warm." The cowboy froze. Her words were clear, but what she suggested was something he had never considered before. The thought of sharing body warmth with someone else made him uncomfortable. His mind raced with hesitation, uncertainty, and doubt. He took a step back, trying to gather his thoughts. I don't know," he stammered. Pride made his voice sound firmer than he felt, but inside, fear was rising. The desert was ruthless, and he knew that hesitation could cost him dearly. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and every muscle in his body ached from the cold. He realized that he had to make a choice quickly, accept her help or risk freezing completely. The woman did not force him, but her eyes held a quiet intensity. "You cannot survive alone tonight," she said. "The desert does not forgive mistakes. Pride will not save you. Only warmth will." The cowboy swallowed hard. He could see the logic in her words, but his mind rebelled against the vulnerability. He had never been in a situation like this, completely dependent on someone he barely knew for life itself. Minutes passed in tense silence. The wind howled outside, rattling the branches of the shelter, and the snow drifted in small clouds. The cowboy's body trembled uncontrollably, and he realized that he was reaching a breaking point. His pride could no longer protect him, and his stubbornness could not shield him from the harsh truth. He was cold. He was weak, and if he did not accept help now, he might not survive the night. Finally, he nodded, barely audible. I'll do it," he whispered, his voice trembling. The woman nodded in understanding, showing no judgment, only calm reassurance. "Good," she said. "Stay close, move carefully. We will survive together." She guided him gently, showing him how to position himself so that he could absorb warmth while remaining safe. It was not an easy task. Every movement required thought and coordination, but he followed her instructions as best as he could. As they settled together, the cowboy felt an unfamiliar mixture of relief and discomfort. Relief because he could feel warmth returning to his core, a sensation he had almost forgotten in the past hours. Discomfort because he had never imagined being this vulnerable with someone else, especially a stranger. His mind raced, trying to reconcile his pride with the need for survival. He realized that the desert had stripped away all illusions of control. Out here, survival was not about ego, it was about pragmatism and trust. Hours passed slowly, but the warmth allowed him to regain a measure of strength. His breathing slowed, and the numbness in his fingers and toes began to ease. He realized that the woman had not just provided physical warmth. She had also given him guidance, patience, and reassurance. Her presence alone was comforting, a reminder that he was not entirely alone in the vast and frozen desert. During quiet moments, they spoke in soft voices. The cowboy asked her about the land, about the desert, and about how she had learned to survive in such extreme conditions. She shared stories of her ancestors, of lessons passed down through generations, and of her experiences navigating the harsh winters of the desert. He listened intently, realizing that this knowledge was invaluable. It was practical, yes, but it was also a way of seeing the world, a philosophy of respect and understanding for the land. At one point, he reflected on his own life. He had always been independent, proud of his ability to survive alone. But now he saw that independence had its limits. Survival required more than skill. It required humility, patience, and the willingness to accept help. He thought of the countless times he had turned away guidance in the past, convinced that he knew best. How many of those times had ended well? Probably not many. The desert had a way of teaching hard lessons, and he was learning one of the hardest. The night seemed endless, but the warmth from the fire and from the woman's careful guidance kept him alive. He noticed small details, the way she adjusted blankets, the way she moved with quiet efficiency, the way she noticed changes in the wind or snow that he would have missed entirely. Every action was purposeful, and he realized that survival was not just about brute strength or willpower. It was about awareness, observation, and respect for the environment. As the hours wore on, the cowboy began to feel a growing trust in the woman. She had guided him without judgment, without force, and with patience that he had never experienced before. He realized that trust was not given lightly. It had to be earned, and she had earned his completely in the harshest possible conditions. For the first time in his life, he understood that survival could be a shared effort, that cooperation could be as important as skill. The wind outside intensified, and snow swirled against the shelter, rattling the branches and blankets. The cowboy shivered again, but the warmth he had received earlier returned steadily. He realized that the night would be long, and that he would have to rely on her guidance until sunrise. It was a humbling experience, and he accepted it fully. He had no other choice, and in accepting it, he was choosing life. By the early hours of the morning, his body had stabilized, and the cold was no longer as immediately threatening. He could think clearly again, though he remained cautious. The desert had shown him its harshest side, and he understood that it could turn deadly in moments. He felt a quiet respect for the woman, for her knowledge, her skill, and her ability to remain calm when danger was all around. He realized that she had been his lifeline, and that he would not have survived without her guidance. The first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, faint and pale, painting the desert in soft shades of white and gray. The cowboy could see the snow-covered dunes stretching endlessly, and he felt a sense of awe at the beauty and the danger of this place. He realized that the desert was not simply a barrier to overcome. It was a living, breathing force that demanded respect. And he had survived, not because of pride or strength alone, but because he had accepted help, listened, and followed guidance. As the sun rose higher, warming the snow just enough to make it glisten, the cowboy felt a renewed sense of determination. The night had been a life-or-death struggle, and he had survived through careful attention, humility, and trust. He looked at the Apache woman, and in her eyes, he saw quiet acknowledgement, a recognition that he had faced the harshest challenge the desert could offer and had learned from it. He realized that survival in the desert was never just about getting through the night. It was about understanding, adapting, and respecting the land and those who knew it well. And for the first time, he felt that he truly understood what it meant to survive, not just to live. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the snow-covered dunes in a soft golden light. The chill remained, but the warmth of daylight brought a small sense of hope. The cowboy stretched carefully, his muscles stiff and sore from the night spent huddled in the shelter. Every joint protested as he moved, but he could feel his strength returning, little by little. He looked around at the desert, now bathed in soft light, and saw beauty in its harshness. The landscape was endless, vast, and quiet, yet it carried a sense of life that demanded respect. The Apache woman was already moving about the small camp. She had prepared a modest breakfast, using dried roots and small amounts of preserved meat she had carried in her pack. She offered him a small portion, and he accepted gratefully. The food was simple, but it warmed him from the inside. He realized that survival was not only about warmth and shelter. It was also about nourishment, careful planning, and attention to the smallest details. He watched her carefully, noting how every motion she made seemed purposeful. Every branch she collected, every piece of firewood she chose, every small gesture was aimed at survival. After they ate, she gestured for him to stand and move with her. "The desert is not safe to rest in one place for too long," she explained. "We must keep moving, even if only slightly. The sun will help, but the cold can still take life quickly if we stay idle." The cowboy nodded, trying to steady his body as he followed her. Every step was a reminder of the strength the desert demanded, and he began to understand that survival was a combination of knowledge, skill, and constant attention. As they walked through the snow-covered dunes, the woman showed him signs of life and subtle dangers that he had overlooked. Tiny tracks in the snow revealed the presence of small animals, some of which could be dangerous if approached carelessly. She pointed out where the snow had drifted into thin layers over hidden ice, teaching him to recognize subtle changes in texture and color. Each lesson was small but crucial. The cowboy realized how little he had known before. He had traveled deserts before, but never one like this, never one that demanded such constant observation and respect. Hours passed, and the bond between them grew stronger, not through words but through shared struggle. The cowboy noticed that he no longer felt the same fear and hesitation that had dominated him during the first night. He had learned to trust her guidance, and in doing so, he had begun to trust himself more. He moved more confidently, carefully following her instructions, adjusting to the rhythm of the desert rather than resisting it. Survival was no longer just about enduring, it was about adapting and learning. At one point, they came across a small, partially frozen stream. The cowboy was tempted to try and cross it alone, but the woman stopped him. "Step carefully," she instructed. "The ice can break. The water is cold, and even a small mistake can cost you." He watched as she tested the ice with a long stick, placing her weight carefully, and then crossing safely. He followed her method, feeling the importance of patience and precision. He realized that every movement, no matter how small, mattered greatly in this desert. By midday, the sun had risen higher, and the temperature had warmed just enough to make travel easier, though still challenging. The woman led him to a small hollow in the dunes, a place where the wind was less harsh and where small shrubs and rocks could provide additional shelter. Here, she showed him how to build a more permanent windbreak using snow, branches, and even the natural curves of the dunes. The cowboy helped, realizing that each action was not just about immediate survival, but about learning techniques that could keep him alive in the future. While they worked, they spoke more freely. The cowboy asked about her life, how she had learned these survival skills, and why she had chosen to spend so much time in the harshest parts of the desert. She spoke with quiet pride about her family and ancestors, explaining how knowledge had been passed down through generations. She emphasized patience, observation, and respect for the land. The cowboy listened, fascinated. He realized that this was more than survival. It was a way of life, a philosophy that connected people to the land in ways he had never imagined. The afternoon passed with more lessons and careful preparation. The woman taught him how to find small sources of water, even when none seemed to exist, by observing plant life and subtle changes in the snow. She showed him how to preserve body heat by layering blankets and using small fires effectively. Every lesson reinforced what he had begun to understand. Survival was not about brute strength or stubbornness, but about knowledge, awareness, and cooperation. As evening approached, the cold began to settle in again, sharper and more insistent than during the day. The cowboy felt the familiar numbness creeping into his fingers and toes, but he no longer panicked. He had learned from the woman how to monitor his body, how to recognize early signs of frostbite and hypothermia, and how to respond effectively. He realized that fear, while natural, could be managed with knowledge and preparation. The woman guided him through another careful night of survival. They huddled close, sharing warmth and following her techniques precisely. This time, the cowboy felt more confident and less anxious. He had learned how to trust her, yes, but also how to trust his own instincts and observations. Every decision they made was deliberate, every movement purposeful. He had grown not just in skill, but in understanding, patience, and humility. During the quiet hours, the woman told him more about the desert's hidden dangers and subtle beauty. She spoke of how animals adapt to the cold, how the wind shapes the dunes, and how snow can conceal both life and danger. The cowboy listened, fascinated. He realized that the desert was not simply an obstacle to overcome. It was a teacher, a force that demanded respect, and a place that could shape those who traveled it carefully. He began to see the landscape differently, noticing details he had missed before, understanding rhythms and patterns that were invisible to the untrained eye. By morning, the cowboy had changed. He was physically stronger, having rested and warmed carefully, but he was also mentally and emotionally transformed. He understood the value of guidance, the necessity of cooperation, and the wisdom of humility. He had survived not just through physical endurance, but through careful observation, respect for the environment, and willingness to accept help. The woman prepared a simple breakfast again, and they shared it quietly. The cowboy felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the food and warmth, but for the lessons and the shared experience. He realized that survival was never a solitary endeavor, especially in such harsh conditions. He had come to value knowledge, patience, and trust more than pride and independence. As they prepared to move on, the woman pointed out landmarks and subtle cues in the dunes that would help him navigate in the future. She taught him how to read the patterns of snow and wind, how to recognize areas that could provide shelter, and how to find water in seemingly barren stretches. Each instruction was a gift, a practical lesson that could save his life if he ever found himself alone again. The cowboy listened intently, absorbing every detail. He realized that he had been given more than survival skills. He had been given insight into a way of life that valued observation, respect, and careful decision-making. He understood that the desert was more than a challenge. It was a teacher, and the woman had been its messenger. By the end of the day, the cowboy felt a profound sense of transformation. He had faced life-threatening cold, physical exhaustion, and fear, and he had survived through guidance, patience, and trust. He had learned to respect the land and its rhythms, to value knowledge over pride, and to understand that survival often requires cooperation and humility. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the snow-covered dunes, the cowboy looked at the woman with gratitude. She had saved his life, taught him invaluable lessons, and shown him the true meaning of survival. He realized that the desert had changed him, and that he would never view the land or his own abilities the same way again. The wind howled around them, but the cowboy no longer felt powerless. He had gained skill, confidence, and understanding. He had learned that survival was not simply enduring hardship, but learning from it, adapting to it, and respecting those who could guide him through it. And most importantly, he had learned that life could be preserved through trust, patience, and careful observation. By nightfall, they prepared another small shelter, using everything they had learned over the past days. The cowboy moved with confidence, following instructions and anticipating the steps needed to survive. He had grown, not just as a traveler, but as a person who could face the harshest challenges with humility, knowledge, and respect. As he lay in the shelter, feeling the warmth return to his body, the cowboy reflected on everything he had learned. The desert was still dangerous, still unforgiving, but he was no longer afraid. He had faced the night, learned its lessons, and survived. And for the first time, he realized that survival was not just about reaching the next town or avoiding death. It was about understanding, adapting, and respecting the forces around him. The morning sun rose slowly over the frozen desert, casting a soft golden glow on the snow-covered dunes. The cold still bit at the cowboy's skin, but he no longer felt the sharp panic he had experienced on his first day. Instead, he felt a quiet confidence, a steady warmth inside that came not just from the fire, but from understanding and experience. The desert, harsh and unforgiving as it was, had taught him lessons he would never forget. He moved carefully, following the path the Apache woman had marked the day before. Every step was deliberate, every motion guided by what he had learned in the past days. He noticed subtle signs in the snow, the tracks of small animals, the drifted patterns of wind across the dunes, and small areas where the ice was thin over hidden water. He understood now that the desert was alive in its own way, speaking in quiet, subtle ways to those who knew how to listen. The woman walked beside him, her presence calm and steady. She had guided him through the cold nights and the frozen days, teaching him survival skills, patience, and humility. But now, the cowboy realized, he had grown in ways beyond simple survival. He had learned to respect the land, to observe and adapt, and most importantly, to trust, not just in her guidance, but in his own ability to apply it. As they traveled, the desert seemed to open up for them. The wind no longer felt like an enemy, but a force to respect and watch carefully. The snow, once blinding and oppressive, now seemed soft and quiet, guiding them gently along the dunes. The cowboy felt a sense of connection he had never experienced before, a bond with both the land and the woman who had guided him. He realized that survival was not just about enduring danger, it was about learning to move in harmony with the world around him. At one point, they stopped at a small rise overlooking the vast expanse of the desert. The sun glinted off the snow, creating sparkling patterns that seemed almost magical. The cowboy felt a deep sense of awe. He thought back to the moment he had first become lost, freezing and alone. The fear he had felt then seemed distant now, replaced by respect, understanding, and quiet gratitude. He turned to the woman and offered a small, sincere smile. She nodded, acknowledging both his survival and his growth. They continued their journey carefully, each step teaching new lessons. The woman showed him how to conserve energy, how to use subtle changes in the landscape to find shelter and warmth, and how to recognize the signs of danger before it arrived. The cowboy absorbed everything eagerly, realizing that the knowledge he was gaining was more valuable than any map, compass, or equipment. It was wisdom that could keep him alive, not just in this desert, but in any harsh landscape he might face in the future. Hours later, they came across a small cluster of rocks that offered natural shelter. The woman explained how these formations could protect travelers from wind, conserve heat, and even provide clues about hidden water sources nearby. The cowboy marveled at how much detail she could see and understand in a landscape he had once thought simple and barren. He realized that survival was never just about strength. It was about attention, knowledge, and the ability to interpret subtle signs in the environment. As they rested, the cowboy began to reflect on his journey. He had arrived in the desert confident, proud, and self-reliant. He had believed that he could face any challenge on his own, but the desert had shown him the limits of that belief. It had forced him to confront fear, cold, exhaustion, and humility, and in doing so, it had taught him lessons that were more valuable than he could have imagined. The Apache woman spoke quietly, breaking the stillness of the desert. "You have learned much," she said. "Not just about survival, but about yourself. You have learned that pride can be dangerous, that strength alone is not enough, and that knowledge and patience are powerful tools. Remember these lessons." The cowboy nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that her words were true, and that they would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the day wore on, they began to descend toward a small valley where the snow had thinned and patches of frozen earth were visible. The landscape was less harsh here, and the cowboy felt a small sense of relief. He knew that the danger was not completely gone, but he also knew that he had the skills and knowledge to navigate it safely. He had been transformed, not just by surviving, but by learning, observing, and trusting. Along the way, the cowboy found himself speaking more freely, sharing stories of his past, his life as a cowboy, and the challenges he had faced before arriving in the desert. The woman listened patiently, occasionally offering quiet advice or insight. He realized that this sharing, this connection, was another form of survival. It was a way to process fear, to gain perspective, and to learn from another's experience. He had never realized how valuable it could be to share knowledge and trust another person completely. As the afternoon sun began to lower, they approached the edge of the desert, where the snow gave way to frozen sand and small patches of vegetation. The journey had been long, challenging, and exhausting, but the cowboy felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had faced the harshest conditions the desert could offer, and he had survived. But more than that, he had grown. He was no longer the proud, stubborn man who had believed he could face anything alone. He had learned humility, patience, and respect for the land, for life, and for the people who could guide him through it. Finally, they reached a small settlement on the edge of the desert. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sight of buildings, animals, and people brought a strange comfort to the cowboy. He realized that he had made it, not because of luck, but because of the lessons he had learned and the guidance he had followed. He turned to the Apache woman, feeling a mixture of gratitude and respect. I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. "You saved my life and taught me more than I ever imagined." She smiled quietly, her eyes calm and wise. "You did the hard part," she said. "You listened, you learned, and you survived. That is worth more than thanks. Remember these lessons and they will guide you through many challenges." She paused for a moment, then added, "The desert gives and takes, teaches and tests. You have passed its lessons and you are stronger because of it." The cowboy nodded, feeling a deep sense of transformation. He realized that survival was never just about reaching the next town or avoiding danger. It was about learning, observing, adapting, and respecting life and the forces around him. He had been tested by the desert, and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware than ever before. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the cowboy watched the woman disappear into the desert. She had guided him safely to the edge of life's harshest challenge, and now it was time for her to return to her world, quiet and powerful. He felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude, knowing that he would never forget her or the lessons she had taught him. He turned toward the settlement, ready to continue his journey in life with a renewed understanding. He knew that he would face challenges again, but he also knew that he now had the tools, knowledge, and humility to face them successfully. He had learned that survival was not just about strength, it was about patience, observation, trust, and respect. As he entered the settlement, the cowboy felt a quiet sense of peace. He had survived the frozen desert, learned its lessons, and been transformed by the experience. He understood now that life, much like the desert, was harsh, unpredictable, and demanding. but also beautiful, full of lessons, and capable of shaping those who respected it. He had been tested, guided, and transformed, and he knew that he would carry these lessons with him forever. The desert behind him was silent, vast, and unchanging, yet it had left a mark on him that would never fade. He had faced fear, cold, and exhaustion, and he had survived through knowledge, patience, and trust. And in that survival, he had discovered a deeper understanding of life, respect for the forces around him, and the quiet power of humility. As night fell on the settlement, the cowboy found a small inn to rest. He felt tired but fulfilled, knowing that he had endured more than he ever thought possible. The lessons of the desert had become part of him, and he knew that he would carry them in his heart forever. Survival had been more than physical, it had been emotional, mental, and spiritual, and he was stronger, wiser, and more aware because of it. The desert would always be there, harsh and unforgiving, but he no longer feared it. He had faced it, learned from it, and survived. And in doing so, he had discovered a part of himself that he had never known, a part capable of humility, trust, observation, and growth. The frozen desert had tested him, shaped him, and changed him, and he knew that he would never be the same again.